In a forensics lab, a technician dusts a doorknob for fingerprints using a bright yellow powder that came from a kitchen spice rack, not a chemical supply catalog. Across town, someone pays $6 for a turmeric latte with a shot of oat milk, blissfully unaware that the powder swirling in their cup is part of a global market now valued in the billions of dollars, traded, tested, and fought over with the same intensity once reserved for gold and pepper. Turmeric is in your shampoo, your sunscreen, your antiseptic wound powder, your golden milk nightcap, and, as it turns out, in the toolkit of crime scene investigators who discovered that its natural fluorescence makes it surprisingly effective at revealing latent prints. It sits quietly in almost every spice cabinet on Earth, so ordinary that most people never once ask where it came from or why it took over the world. That is precisely the question worth asking. How does a knobby, unglamorous root, something that looks like ginger's dowager cousin, end up simultaneously in luxury skincare, ancient temple rituals, criminal investigations, and multi-billion-dollar supplement scandals? The honest answer involves sacred fire, imperial greed, industrial ambition, scientific fraud, and a marketing campaign so successful it convinced an entire generation that a stew powder was an ancient superfood elixir. We are going to trace turmeric from the temples of ancient India to the shelves of your local grocery store. And along the way we will meet monks, monopolists, colonial administrators, con artists, and at least one scientist who blew the whistle on an industry built partly on myth. Some of what you think you know about this spice, including the very idea of curry powder, is going to turn out to be a colonial invention, dressed up as ancient tradition. Stick around, because the story of turmeric is not really about food at all. It is about how empires manufacture authenticity, how colonization repackages culture for profit, and how something humble enough to stain your fingers orange became one of the most valuable, most misunderstood commodities on the planet. Before turmeric was a wellness trend or a forensic tool, it was something far more powerful in the eyes of the people who first used it. Sacred. And that is where our story actually begins, thousands of years before anyone had ever heard the word curry. Long before turmeric was a commodity, it was a covenant between the living and the divine. In the river valleys of ancient India, farmers noticed something strange about the knobby, fibrous root they pulled from the earth. Sliced open, it revealed a color that seemed to defy the natural palette around it, a deep, saturated orange gold that stained skin, cloth, and stone alike, and refused to fade quickly. To a people already attuned to the symbolic power of color, this was not a coincidence. This was a sign. Turmeric became associated with the sun, with fire, with purity, and with the divine feminine, and it worked its way into the earliest layers of Hindu ritual practice so thoroughly that it is difficult to find a major life ceremony in ancient India where it does not appear. Weddings, in particular, became inseparable from turmeric. The application of turmeric paste to the skin of a bride and groom, a ritual still practiced today under names like haldi, was believed to purify the body, ward off evil spirits, and bless the union with prosperity. Priests used it in religious offerings. Households smeared it across thresholds during festivals to invite good fortune and repel misfortune. It was rubbed onto newborns, dabbed onto foreheads, mixed into ceremonial powders thrown during celebrations that survive in modern form as the color festival, known as Holi. None of this was decorative flourish. In a worldview where color carried moral and spiritual weight, turmeric's gold was read as a physical manifestation of light, auspiciousness, and status. which meant that long before anyone was trading it for profit, it was already worth more than its weight in ordinary crops. But turmeric's power was not only symbolic. Ancient physicians practicing what would become known as Ayurveda, one of the world's oldest continuous systems of medicine, catalogued the root as an essential remedy, prescribing it for wounds, skin conditions, digestive trouble, and inflammation centuries before Western science would isolate the compound responsible, curcumin, and confirm that the ancient physicians were onto something real. This is worth sitting with for a second. We tend to imagine ancient medicine as superstition dressed up as science. Here, the causation ran the other way. Modern science eventually caught up to a folk pharmacology that had been quietly correct for thousands of years. Turmeric was not just a spice in this world. It was medicine, ritual object, cosmetic, and social signal rolled into a single root, which meant access to it, and the ability to use it lavishly became its own kind of status symbol. Wealthier households used more of it, used it more visibly, and used it in contexts where its cost and effort were meant to be noticed. This is the part of the story that later marketing campaigns and colonial administrators would conveniently forget or deliberately obscure. Turmeric was never humble. It was aspirational before it was affordable, sacred before it was seasoning, and thoroughly woven into the spiritual architecture of a civilization long before a single European trader ever laid eyes on it. That obscurity would not last. Because a root this valuable, this visually striking, and this deeply embedded in ritual life was never going to stay confined to one region. Word of it, and eventually the root itself, began moving outward along the same routes already carrying pepper, cinnamon, and cloves toward markets that had no idea what they were about to receive. So how does a sacred root, confined to Indian temples and wedding ceremonies, end up on trade manifests bound for foreign ports? The answer, unsurprisingly, is the same answer to almost every question about how ancient luxury goods spread. Merchants figured out they could charge for it. Somewhere in the centuries before the Common Era, turmeric began moving along the same maritime and overland networks, already ferrying pepper, cinnamon, and cloves out of South Asia and into the wider ancient world. These were not casual exchanges. They were established, organized trade corridors linking Indian ports to Chinese markets, to Arabian and Persian trading posts, and eventually to East Africa. All of it decades and centuries before anyone in Lisbon, Amsterdam, or London had heard the word turmeric. Chinese medical texts document turmeric's arrival and adoption into traditional Chinese medicine, where it was folded into an existing pharmacological tradition, much the way it had been folded into Ayurveda, valued for treating inflammation and circulatory issues. Arab traders, who by this point had turned the spice trade into a genuinely sophisticated commercial enterprise stretching from the Indian coast to the Mediterranean, carried turmeric alongside their more famous cargo of pepper and cinnamon, often obscuring its exact origins to protect their monopoly on the supply chain. This was standard practice for spice merchants of the era. Keep the buyer ignorant of where the product actually comes from, and you keep the markup intact. It is a business model that would echo down through centuries of the spice trade, and one that turmeric's own story would repeat again and again. Here is where the myth-making begins in earnest, and where we need to pause and correct a persistent piece of misinformation. Turmeric picked up the nickname Indian saffron somewhere along these trade routes, likely because of its vivid yellow-orange color, which visually echoed the prized red-gold threads of true saffron harvested from crocus flowers in Persia and the Mediterranean. The name stuck. It is still used today on spice packaging and in casual conversation, but the nickname is, and always was, marketing dressed up as botany. Saffron and turmeric are not related. They do not come from the same plant family, they are not harvested the same way, and critically, they were never priced the same way. Because turmeric is a root that grows abundantly and can be harvested in bulk, while saffron requires hand-picking tens of thousands of individual crocus stigmas to produce a single kilogram, making it one of the most labor-intensive and expensive substances on Earth by weight. Calling turmeric Indian saffron was never an admission of equivalence. It was a rhetorical shortcut, a way for traders to borrow saffron's reputation for luxury and imply comparable value in a product that was, by comparison, cheap to produce and easy to source. Think about that for a second. An entire branding strategy built centuries before the word branding existed, designed to inflate the perceived worth of a common root by association with a genuinely rare one. It worked well enough that we are still untangling the confusion today. What the nickname did get right, even if by accident, was color. Turmeric's pigment. Curcumin produces a dye and a visual signature striking enough to pass, at a glance and in the right light, for something far more expensive. That visual power would matter enormously later, once European colonial economies started looking at turmeric not as medicine or ritual object, but as a commodity to extract, control, and profit from. But before we get to the colonial land grab, it is worth sitting with this ancient trade network for a moment, because it tells us something the later empires would rather we forget. Global fascination with turmeric did not begin with European ships. It began more than 1,000 years earlier, carried by Arab dhows and Chinese junks and camel caravans, moving quietly and profitably across 3 continents, long before anyone in Europe had a name for it at all. Then came the ships. By the early 16th century, Portuguese sailors had muscled their way into the ports of Western India, and with them came a new philosophy of trade, not partnership, but control. The Portuguese crown did not simply want to buy spices, it wanted to own the routes, the ports, and ideally the entire supply, cutting out the Arab middlemen who had quietly profited from turmeric and its neighbors for 1,000 years. Turmeric itself was never the crown jewel of this obsession. Pepper was. Cinnamon was. Turmeric, cheap, bulky, and already available almost everywhere it grew, did not command the eye-watering margins that drove men to sail around a continent. But it rode along in the holds regardless, part of the general cargo of empire, and its presence in ledgers from Goa to Lisbon tells us something quietly important. Even the powers obsessed with the rarest, most glamorous spices still found it worth their time to move turmeric in bulk. Volume, it turns out, has its own kind of value. The Dutch arrived next, and they were, if anything, more ruthless about it. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, built an entire commercial war machine around spice monopolies, and its agents in the field were not diplomats. They were enforcers with balance sheets. Picture a company trader stationed in a humid warehouse on the Malabar coast, tallying sacks of dried root by lantern light, calculating not what turmeric was worth in a temple ceremony back in Gujarat, but what it could fetch once relabeled, reweighed, and shipped onward through a controlled European distribution network. To that trader, turmeric's sacred history was irrelevant. What mattered was leverage. Controlling a spice route meant controlling price. And controlling price meant controlling entire regional economies that depended on the harvest. The British East India Company, chartered in 1600 and increasingly dominant across the 18th century, absorbed this same logic and scaled it further, eventually administering Indian trade under a colonial bureaucracy that taxed, licensed, and regulated agricultural production in ways that had never existed under earlier local systems. Local rulers had taxed spice trade before, certainly, extracting tolls at ports and market duties in the old kingdoms of southern India. But colonial administrators formalized and centralized that extraction on an industrial scale, treating an entire subcontinent's agricultural output as a ledger entry in a London office. The irony sits heavy here, and it is worth pausing on. A route that Vedic priests had once treated as too sacred to bargain over was now a line item in a colonial trading company's annual report, its price set not by ritual value or medicinal reputation, but by shipping costs, tariff schedules, and the appetites of European markets thousands of miles from the fields where it grew. This is the moment turmeric fully crosses over, from a substance embedded in meaning to a substance embedded in money. And once that crossing happened, it could not be undone. The next chapter of turmeric's story would not be written by priests or even by company traders haggling over sacks in a warehouse. It would be written by marketers back in Britain, inventing something that never existed in India at all, something that would forever after be mistaken for ancient tradition. Ask most people where curry powder comes from, and they will tell you it is an ancient Indian spice blend, handed down through generations, sealed in clay jars in villages, long before anyone in Europe had ever tasted a mango. It sounds right. It feels right. It is also almost entirely wrong. There is no dish in the vast, regional, wildly varied cooking traditions of the Indian subcontinent that traditionally goes by the single word curry powder. What exists instead is an enormous diversity of masalas, individually ground and blended for specific dishes, specific regions, specific households, often mixed fresh the same day they are cooked rather than stored on a shelf for months. A cook in Punjab and a cook in Kerala might use entirely different combinations of turmeric, coriander, cumin, chili, and a dozen other ingredients, adjusted by taste, season, and family recipe. There was no standardized yellow powder sitting in a single tin labeled curry, waiting to be sprinkled on anything and everything. That product, the one sitting in supermarkets from London to Los Angeles right now, was invented by the British. Specifically, it was invented for British colonial administrators and soldiers returning home from India in the 18th and 19th centuries who had acquired a taste for Indian flavors but had no interest in learning the actual techniques, ratios, or fresh grinding required to reproduce them. So enterprising British and European spice merchants did what merchants have always done when faced with complexity. They simplified it into something sellable. They took the general idea of an Indian spice-forward sauce, flattened its regional diversity into a single generic profile, built heavily around turmeric for color and coriander, and cumin for base flavor, dried and standardized it, and packaged it into tins with imperial branding designed to evoke the exotic East. The word curry itself likely derives from the Tamil word curry, meaning sauce or relish. But by the time the British were done with it, the word had been stretched to cover an entire invented category of food that did not correspond to anything a cook in Delhi or Chennai would have recognized as a single dish. Turmeric became the anchor ingredient precisely because of its color. It was cheap, It was already flowing through colonial trade networks in bulk, and it turned everything a rich, appetizing yellow that signaled authentic Indian food to European consumers who had no other reference point. This is the deception at the heart of curry powder. It was never a discovery of ancient tradition. It was a colonial packaging solution, engineered for export convenience and foreign palates, that then got exported back to the world, including eventually back to India itself, as a supposedly traditional product. Think about that for a second. An empire took a fragmented, sophisticated culinary landscape, boiled it down into a shelf-stable yellow powder for the convenience of the people who had colonized it, and that invented shortcut became so globally dominant that today it is often mistaken for the authentic original it actually erased. Turmeric did not just travel through empire. It was rebranded by empire, repackaged by empire, and sold back to the world wearing a costume of ancient authenticity it never actually possessed. By the middle of the 19th century, turmeric had already survived temples, trade routes, and the branding department of the British Empire. What it had not yet survived was the machine. The Industrial Revolution did to turmeric what it did to nearly every raw material on Earth. It stripped away the human hands that had once ground it stone by stone in a village courtyard, and replaced them with steel rollers, steam power, and a ledger. Turmeric had been a ritual good, then a trade good, then a colonial good. Now it was about to become something new entirely. A commodity, in the coldest, most modern sense of that word, measured in tons rather than handfuls. For most of history, turning dried turmeric rhizome into powder was slow, local, and physical. Workers pounded it in stone mortars, or ground it between grooved wheels turned by hand or by ox, batch by batch, village by village, with quality and fineness varying wildly from one grinder to the next. That was fine when turmeric served a temple ceremony or a single household kitchen. It was hopelessly inadequate for a British Empire that wanted to ship consistent, shelf-stable curry powder to garrisons in Bombay, dinner tables in London, and grocers in Liverpool, all expecting the same color, the same texture, and the same taste every single time. Mechanized grinding solved that problem. Steam-powered mills, first appearing in British and colonial processing centers through the latter half of the 19th century, could pulverize dried rhizome into a fine, uniform powder far faster and in far greater volume than any human grinder, and could do it identically, shipment after shipment. Meanwhile, steamships were quietly demolishing the old constraint that had shaped the spice trade for 3,000 years. Time, a journey from Indian ports to European markets that had once taken the better part of a year under sail, could now be measured in weeks, which meant turmeric could move faster, spoil less, and be sold cheaper, which meant more of it could be sold to more people who had never once thought of it as sacred. This is where the outsider entrepreneur enters the story, the archetype of the disruptor, who takes a ritual good and turns it into a shelf product. Across Britain and its colonial ports in this period, a new class of spice merchant emerged, men without noble titles or East India Company charters, who built their fortunes not on conquest, but on packaging. They bought turmeric in bulk from Indian growers and colonial trading houses, ran it through industrial grinding mills, blended it into standardized curry powders, and sealed it into tins and paper packets, stamped with reassuring, exotic-sounding brand names, designed to sell an idea of India to people who would never set foot there. This was the birth of the spice aisle, as we now understand it. Turmeric, once handled with ceremonial care by priests, measuring pinches for a wedding blessing, was now shoveled by the sack into grinding hoppers, weighed on industrial scales, and sold by the ounce to housewives in industrial cities who had no idea they were holding a substance once reserved for gods. The sacred root had become inventory. And once something becomes inventory, the market always finds a way to make more of it, faster, cheaper, and with far less regard for what it once meant. Fast forward to the laboratory, and turmeric's story takes another sharp turn, this time from the grinding mill to the microscope. For most of the 20th century, turmeric sat quietly in Western kitchens as a curiosity, the thing that turned mustard yellow and stained your fingers, but rarely something anyone thought to study seriously. That changed as researchers began isolating the compound responsible for turmeric's color and, they suspected, much of its traditional medicinal reputation, curcumin. Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine had used turmeric for centuries to treat inflammation, wounds, digestive complaints, and skin conditions. But that knowledge lived in oral tradition and practitioner manuals, not peer-reviewed journals. Modern researchers set out to test whether the folklore held any scientific water. And to a surprising degree, it did. Laboratory studies began showing curcumin exhibited genuine anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties at the cellular level, results significant enough that by the early 21st century curcumin had become one of the most heavily studied plant compounds in the world, with thousands of published papers examining its potential role in everything from arthritis to metabolic disorders. Here is the catch, though, the one the supplement bottles rarely mention. Curcumin is notoriously difficult for the human body to absorb. Eaten in ordinary food, most of it passes through the digestive system largely unused. That inconvenient biochemical fact did nothing to slow the marketing machine. If anything, it accelerated it, because now there was a scientific-sounding hook. Absorption technology, bioavailability enhancement, patented delivery systems, to justify premium pricing on turmeric supplements that promised what turmeric on a spice rack never quite could. The wellness industry did what industries do. It took a genuinely interesting finding and inflated it into a cure-all. Turmeric lattes, turmeric shots, turmeric skincare, turmeric everything. Global demand surged. And demand, as history had already shown with turmeric more than once, creates pressure, and pressure creates fraud. Because turmeric's market value depends heavily on its vivid, saturated yellow-orange color, some producers and traders discovered a shortcut, adulterating turmeric powder with lead chromate, an industrial pigment, to make cheaper or lower-quality turmeric look richer and more vibrant than it actually was. Lead chromate is not a food additive. It is a toxic industrial compound, and prolonged exposure to lead in any form carries serious health risks, particularly for children, including neurological and developmental harm. Testing programs in several turmeric-producing and consuming regions began flagging alarming lead contamination levels in turmeric supply chains, a discovery that landed with particular irony given turmeric's rebranded image as a purity-signaling superfood, the golden ingredient of clean eating and detox culture. The substance being sold to health-conscious consumers as an antioxidant miracle was, in some documented cases, quietly laced with a neurotoxin to make it look more appetizing on a supermarket shelf. That contradiction, ancient healing symbol on the label, industrial poison in the powder, deserves a moment to sit with you, because it captures something essential about turmeric's entire journey. Every time the root gets a new identity, sacred offering, colonial commodity, wellness miracle, someone downstream finds a way to exploit the gap between image and substance. Before we go further into who paid the real price for that gap, if you're finding these hidden histories as unsettling and fascinating as we do, take a second to subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every episode. Now, back to the supply chain, and the people standing at the bottom of it. Behind every tin of curry powder and every capsule of curcumin extract sits a farmer bent over a small plot of land, and that farmer's story rarely makes it onto the packaging. Turmeric farming remains grueling, low-margin agricultural labor, largely unchanged in its basic physical demands, even as the industry around it has modernized beyond recognition. The rhizomes must be dug by hand, boiled for hours to develop their color and aroma, then dried in the sun for days before grinding. A process that has barely changed in centuries, even as the finished product now travels through refrigerated shipping containers and glossy marketing campaigns worth billions. The people performing that labor typically see the smallest fraction of the final retail price, a pattern common across global spice and commodity chains, where value accumulates at the processing, branding, and retail end, far from the soil where the plant actually grew. Small farmers, often operating on tight seasonal credit and vulnerable to price swings dictated by traders and export markets they never directly interact with, absorb most of the risk while capturing little of the reward. Add to that the pressure some producers face to cut corners, whether through inherited processing shortcuts or deliberate adulteration further down the chain, and you begin to see how a contamination scandal is never just a chemistry problem. It is also a poverty problem, an incentive problem, a structural problem baked into a supply chain built centuries ago to extract value outward and upward, from village to port to foreign shelf. Regulatory response to the lead chromate contamination scandal followed a familiar pattern. Testing programs identified the problem, public health agencies issued warnings, and export and import authorities began tightening inspection standards for turmeric entering international markets. Stricter limits on permissible lead content, expanded laboratory testing, and closer scrutiny of supply chains became part of the regulatory response, aimed at rebuilding consumer confidence and forcing accountability further back down the chain toward processors and distributors. But regulation aimed at the top of a supply chain does not automatically fix conditions at the bottom of it. Tightening import standards can protect consumers in wealthy markets while doing little to address the economic pressures that pushed adulteration into the chain in the first place, and doing even less to raise the daily wages of the people harvesting and processing the raw root. This is the quieter, less quotable part of turmeric's modern story. Not the superfood spin, not the ancient sacred root branding, but the unglamorous economics of who actually profits when a 5,000-year-old ritual substance becomes a globally traded commodity worth billions of dollars a year. The workers standing at the beginning of that chain are, in a very real sense, still living inside the same basic power imbalance that shaped turmeric's story under colonial administrations centuries ago. Only now the buyer is a multinational supplement brand instead of an imperial trading company, and the currency is a purchase order instead of a tax levy. The gold has changed hands many times. The people digging it out of the ground have, historically, changed positions far less. So we arrive back where we started, in the latte cup, and the capsule bottle and the skincare aisle, staring at a spice that costs pennies an ounce and somehow generates a global market worth billions of dollars a year. Now you know why that number should never have surprised you in the first place. Turmeric did not become valuable overnight, and it did not become valuable by accident. It was sacred before it was sellable, smeared on the skin of brides and painted onto temple idols 1,000 years before anyone thought to put it in a jar with a barcode. It was medicine before it was a marketing claim, prescribed by Ayurvedic physicians who never once used the word superfood and never needed to, because they were not selling anything, they were treating patients. It was cargo before it was a wellness lifestyle, packed into the hulls of Arab dhows and Dutch merchant ships by men who could not have cared less about its spiritual meaning and cared a great deal about its weight, its price, and its shelf life. It was a colonial invention before it was a curry night takeaway staple, repackaged by British merchants into a standardized yellow powder that has more to do with Victorian export logistics than with any single Indian kitchen. And it was an industrial commodity before it was an Instagram wellness shot, ground by steam-powered mills and shipped by steam-powered hulls that turned a ritual substance into a mass-market product almost a century before anyone isolated curcumin in a laboratory. Every hand this route has passed through has told a different story about what turmeric is for. The priest called it purity, the trader called it profit, the colonial administrator called it revenue, the chemist called it curcumin, the marketer called it superfood, and the farmer, standing in a field in Telangana or Tamil Nadu with stained hands and a harvesting knife, has mostly just called it work. All of these stories are true at once, which is precisely what makes turmeric such a strange object to hold in your hand. It is a plant that has been simultaneously sacred and commercial for something like 4,000 years, and it has never fully resolved the tension between those two identities, because nobody involved in its history ever actually needed to resolve it. The temple did not care that traders were profiting off the same root used in wedding rituals. The colonial merchant did not care that he was flattening centuries of regional cooking into a single tin of curry powder. And the modern supplement industry does not particularly care that the bioavailability breakthrough on its label is quietly leaning on the reputation of a compound that plain turmeric, eaten plain, mostly fails to deliver into your bloodstream at all. Each era simply layered its own use on top of the one before it, and the root absorbed all of it without complaint, the way it absorbs everything else, staining every surface it touches a color that does not wash out easily. That, in the end, might be the most honest metaphor turmeric has to offer. It stains. History, once it touches something, tends to leave a mark that outlives the moment. Sacred pigment, imperial cargo, factory product, wellness prop, and, underneath all of it, still a laborer's crop, grown by people who see the smallest share of the profit their own hands create. So the next time you sprinkle it into a curry, or drop it into a latte, or swallow it in a capsule promising to fix your joints, remember what you are actually holding. Not a trendy new discovery, not an ancient unchanged tradition either. Something stranger than both, a 5,000-year negotiation between the sacred and the commercial that never really ended. It just changed packaging. Turmeric was never simply a spice. It was always a transaction, dressed up in gold.